Hey, hi, hello. Welcome to Diana Emerson. Today we're listening to Blood and Lust, the new detectives.
A teenage girl is found murdered in her Indiana home, and police soon suspect that she is not this killer's only victim. Detectives race the clock to track a serial killer across the country before he strikes again. Someone is targeting elderly women in a gated California community. With no witnesses and little physical evidence, investigators struggle to find a link between the murders. For homicide investigators, it's difficult to predict when and where a serial killer will strike next. But with the help of forensic examiners, they can isolate tiny clues that can lead them to the killer who is driven by bloodlust. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. An hour's drive south of Chicago, Griffith, Indiana is home to 18,000 people. People drawn here by the quiet lifestyle and the low crime rate. Around 7 p.m. on October 13, 1987, 15-year-old Christine Gallagher returned home from school.
What happened at the swim meet today?
She called out to her older sister, Wendy, but there was no response.
Hey, Wendy.
Though Mrs. Gallagher was still at work, Wendy should have been home from school hours ago. Christine checked the bedroom.
Oh, Wendy.
There she found 16-year-old Wendy's lifeless body on the floor. Griffith police and crime scene units were immediately dispatched to the Gallagher apartment. The distraught teenager was taken to a squad car as police made their way into the residence. Inside the apartment, the living room was neat and orderly. But in the bedroom, police discovered the gruesome scene. The semi-nude victim had been gagged, her hands tied behind her back with a bedsheet. She'd been stabbed repeatedly. It appeared that she had been sexually assaulted, but no biological evidence was recovered. For Lieutenant John Mowry of the Griffith Police Department, the scene was difficult to comprehend.
When I walked into that apartment and saw the victim, Wendy Gallagher, and saw the savage manner in which she had been killed, I've never seen anything like that. I was on the department 17 years prior to that, have investigated other homicides, never seen anything that even comes descriptively close to the way that scene was.
Investigators began to methodically process the scene. Next to the window, they discovered blood spatter on the wall and curtain. Hoping to find prints, they treated the wall with silver nitrate, a chemical that reacts to the oils found in fingers and palms. Then they scanned the area with a light source. A partial palm print and more blood spatter emerged. The section of wall was removed and forwarded to the crime lab. In the living room, investigators collected a drinking glass with smudged fingerprints. They also found a denim jacket hanging on the back of a chair. Searching the pockets, they found a driver's license. It belonged to a teenage boy with a local address. On the kitchen counter, detectives recovered a woman's purse. There was no identification inside. Outside, Christine told police that her father had dropped her off after a school swim meet. She said that since their parents' recent divorce, she and Wendy would sometimes be by themselves after school until Mrs. Gallagher returned from work soon after. As Christine continued answering questions, one of the investigators brought out the purse found in the kitchen.
Let me show you something.
Christine said it was hers. She added that when she arrived home, she didn't remember seeing Wendy's purse anywhere. Then, Mrs. Gallagher returned from work and learned about the murder. Overwhelmed with grief, she told police she couldn't believe anyone would want to kill her daughter. Wendy was such a beautiful and cheerful girl. When shown the ID from the denim jacket, the Gallaghers recognized the boy immediately. He was Wendy's boyfriend. Looking for any clue to the killer's identity, examiners at the Lake County Crime Lab began to analyze the prints recovered from the Gallagher apartment. They started with a smudged drinking glass. When dusted with black powder, two distinct sets of fingerprints were revealed. Analysis of the arches, whorls, and loops that makes each print unique established that one set was Wendy's. But the second set of prints didn't match any of the Gallaghers. Next, examiners turned to the section of wall removed from Wendy's bedroom. To preserve the fragile drywall, they worked from photographs. Again, the partial palm print didn't match samples taken from any of the Gallaghers. Its position on the drywall in relation to the blood found around the window led evidence technician Ronald Latch to conclude that whoever left it had been startled.
He put one hand on the wall and looked out the curtain, because you could see blood on the edge of the curtain and on the wall, and looking out to see if somebody was coming. Maybe he heard a voice or a car door slam.
But the concern must have been short-lived. Crime scene analysis uncovered no signs of a forced entry or exit. It appeared that after committing this brutal murder, the killer calmly left the apartment, probably through the front door. Convinced that the unidentified prints were the key to revealing the killer's identity, investigators ran them through AFIS, a computer database that holds millions of fingerprint records. But no matches were found. Detectives turned to Wendy's boyfriend for answers. They wanted to know why his jacket and ID were found in the Gallagher's apartment. The team that Wendy cold that day at school. He'd loaned her his jacket and she'd worn it home. He said he was home with his parents during the time of the murder.
School when she was cold, so I took it off and let her have it.
He also told police he had no idea who could have hurt Wendy. She was very popular at school, where she was an honor student and a pom-pom girl. He said Wendy was a lot of fun to be with, and he couldn't believe she was gone. Though he had a solid alibi, detectives fingerprinted him before letting him go. But analysis of his prints later confirmed his innocence. Police spent the next several days interviewing dozens of Wendy's friends and neighbors. Over 50 potential suspects were developed, but fingerprint analysis eliminated all of them. According to Detective Carl Grimmer, tensions in the small town grew as the investigation hit a dead end.
Within the community of Griffith, after this occurred, there's a lot of fear. We didn't know who we were looking for. We didn't know if we were looking for somebody that lived in our town, somebody in a neighboring town, or if it could have been a drifter.
But a week after the murder, police got a solid lead. A woman in Chicago had found Wendy's missing purse.
I understand you found the purse that we were looking for.
The purse somehow ended up in my purse.
She explained that her own purse had been snatched during an assault. When it was later recovered from a dumpster and returned, she opened it and found Wendy Gallagher's purse and ID stuffed inside. Then she'd heard about the murder in Griffith.
Down in the alley, and this car pulls up.
The woman said that as she left work through the back door, a man with brown hair and a mustache jumped out of a blue car. He grabbed her and threatened her with a knife. As they struggled, a delivery truck pulled up. The assailant grabbed her purse and fled. But he had left behind valuable evidence. A witness who could identify him, and a physical link to Wendy's murder.
I recall he had, I guess, brown hair.
Police quickly released a composite sketch of the suspect, along with a description of his blue car. Over the next several weeks, they received many leads as a result, but none of them panned out. Despite the lack of progress, investigators refused to give up.
Everybody who had walked into that crime scene that night and saw Wendy, that's all the incentive you needed to keep going, to find out who had done that to her.
Griffith detectives had a composite sketch and fingerprints that could prove murder. But until they could identify their suspect, that evidence was meaningless. And all indications suggested that Wendy Gallagher was not going to be this killer's last victim. Several months had passed with little progress in the murder case of 16-year-old Wendy Gallagher. Though Griffith, Indiana police had a composite drawing of their suspect and prints recovered from the murder scene, his identity and his whereabouts remained unknown. As they struggled to keep the case alive, an improbable lead was called in by police in Pasco County, Florida, located more than 1,100 miles away from Griffith, Indiana. While investigating the homicide of a 14-year-old girl there, Florida police believed that a resident had uncovered a connection to Wendy Gallagher's unsolved murder.
Who's the lead detective in this case?
That resident, Diane Collins, had just moved to Pasco County from Griffith, Indiana. As details of the Florida murder were made public, Diane immediately noticed similarities to the homicide in Griffith. The frighteningly familiar details compelled her to contact the police.
I was very much struck by the fact that this was another young teenage girl who was murdered in her home after school hours, just as Wendy was in the community I had just left.
Griffith police were skeptical that such a tenuous lead could impact their case, but they had little else to go on. They asked Pasco County investigators to forward the case files. According to police reports, in January 1988, 14-year-old Janet Clark was discovered in her bedroom by her younger brother shortly after 6 p.m. He and Mr. Clark had just returned home from running an errand. Janet had been home from school just a few hours. When police arrived, they found Janet's partially clad body gagged and bound, her hands tied together with a bedsheet. She'd been viciously knifed and raped. No prints had been found at the scene. And while DNA evidence was recovered during autopsy, investigators had no suspect to link it to. But now, Griffith detective Carl Grimmer realized that Diane Collins' instincts might have been dead on.
We thought it was a long shot that the two cases could be connected. But when we sat and studied the photos, studied the crime scenes, we became stronger and stronger in our belief that they probably were connected. It's just, you had to see it to see the similarities. It's almost like there was a signature.
Believing they were now searching for the same killer, the two departments began exchanging information. Pasco County, Florida police intensified their investigation. One of the Clark's neighbors recalled a man in the neighborhood around the time of Janet's murder. She had never seen him before. She described the man to a police sketch artist as being in his late 20s, with dark hair and a mustache. She believed that he was driving a late model red Corvette with Missouri license plates. Though the description of the vehicle was different, Griffith police couldn't ignore the striking similarities to their suspect. For Detective Mowry, there was little doubt that his serial killer was on the loose.
Time definitely was our enemy. We knew from what we had seen thus far how savage this person was. So we were virtually racing against a clock. We wanted to apprehend him as quickly as we could to prevent him from hurting anybody else.
But police knew that tracking a multi-state killer would be difficult. Until he struck again, all they could do was wait. And they feared this killer wouldn't make them wait very long. 2 months later, police in Beaumont, Texas responded to reports of gunfire at a local motel. Responding officers burst into the room where the shots had been heard. There, they discovered one of their own, Officer Paul Halsey, unconscious, the victim of a gunshot wound. The fallen officer had notified dispatch just a few minutes before that he was checking on the driver of a stolen vehicle who had just entered one of the rooms. Officer Halsey was rushed to the hospital, but his injuries proved fatal. He died a short while later. A witness at the motel stated that he heard gunfire and looked out his window. He saw a man with dark hair and a mustache speed away in a red Corvette. An all-points bulletin was issued for the red sports car. And within a few minutes, dispatchers reported that the vehicle had been spotted. The sports car was able to elude police for more than 20 miles. But the driver suddenly lost control, and the car swerved off the road. He fled into a wooded area on foot and disappeared. Texas authorities began preparing their manhunt for a suspected cop killer. While police in Indiana and Florida struggled to track down a serial killer who preyed upon young girls, police 2,000 miles away in Beaumont, Texas, were on the trail of a suspected cop killer. Though the suspect had managed to escape, police had his abandoned red Corvette. Inside, they recovered a blood-stained .357 Magnum that had been recently fired. They also found stolen license plates, including a set from Missouri. Now their focus was on finding the driver. Detective Ray Beck of the Beaumont Police Department organized the matter.
The word was out. So we had officers coming in from everywhere, just volunteering their time, their effort. So manpower was unbelievable.
Through witnesses, police learned that the suspect had jumped into a taxi and was headed toward Houston. Officers quickly caught up with the man.
Taxi driver, get out of the car! Let's take passenger, get your hands up!
The man believed responsible for the murder of Officer Halsey was taken into custody.
Get out of the car. Get hands up. Turn around.
The suspect, identified as 28-year-old Michael Lee Lockhart, was questioned at the Beaumont police station. He immediately confessed to shooting Officer Halsey, but offered no explanation. It seemed too easy. Robert Hobbs, an investigator with the Jefferson County District Attorney's Office, recalls Lockhart's interview.
He was very calm. He was very collected. We knew right away that that this was not our typical criminal in Southeast Texas, and that we would have our work cut out for us.
Their instincts told them Lockhart wouldn't have killed a police officer over a stolen car. There had to be more, a lot more, to this murder. Investigators fingerprinted Lockhart and collected hair samples. He was held without bond on capital murder charges. Ballistics results, bolstered by Lockhart's confession, gave Beaumont detectives an airtight case. But Lockhart's quick confession still seemed too calculated, as if he might be trying to head off further investigation. Evidence recovered from Lockhart's motel room indicated he'd been on the move for months. Police had recovered several hotel and restaurant receipts from throughout the Midwest. But what was he running from? Hoping to find out, Detective Ray Beck wrote an article profiling Lockhart and details of Officer Halsey's murder for a national law enforcement magazine. The tactic paid off. A detective working the Janet Clark murder in Pasco County, Florida, read the article on Lockhart and Officer Halsey's murder. He then called the Beaumont Police Department. Detective Beck quickly understood why.
One of the missing links to their case was the fact that their red Corvette had Missouri license plates. And that was one of the pieces of evidence that we had here was Missouri license plates that we found in the Corvette.
Detective Beck next learned about the connection to Wendy Gallagher's murder. Investigators working that case in Griffith, Indiana, were immediately notified. They requested that Lockhart's prints be forwarded to the Lake County Crime Lab. Hoping they had the evidence they needed to prove murder, examiners went to work, comparing Lockhart's fingerprints to those recovered from the Wendy Gallagher crime scene. After scrutinizing and comparing both sets of prints, examiner Ronald Blatch was certain that Wendy's killer had been found.
The fingerprints we found at the scene put Michael Lee Lockhart in that apartment, and the palm prints put him right next to the body of the victim, where there was blood and on the curtain in the wall.
Nearly 8 months after Wendy Gallagher was found murdered in her home, investigators finally had the evidence they needed to charge Michael Lee Lockhart with her murder.
I felt a great sense of relief because I knew that he couldn't commit any more crimes. And I also felt happy that we would be able to contribute and help bring some semblance of closure to the Gallagher family.
On June 30th, 1988, DNA analysis confirmed that Lockhart had murdered and sexually assaulted Janet Clark in Florida. Working together, 3 police agencies had tied 3 seemingly unrelated murders to one predator. Based on the evidence, police believe that Lockhart traveled the country in search of his next victim. He would prowl an area, hunting for vulnerable young victims. When he knew they were alone, he would con his way into their homes, where he would rape and murder them. Michael Lee Lockhart stood trial for murder in all 3 states. He was sentenced to death in each trial. In Texas, on December 9, 1997, Michael Lee Lockhart was executed for his crimes. It took the cooperative effort of 3 police departments to track a transient serial killer across the United States. But sometimes, murderers who stay in one place are just as hard for investigators to find. 75 miles from Los Angeles, Riverside County, California is a haven for retirees and people looking to escape the problems of urban life. But on February 16, 1994, a 911 call brought police from the Riverside County Sheriff's Office to a condo in the upscale community of Canyon Lake. There, investigators found the body of 86-year-old Norma Davis slumped in an easy chair. A phone cord was wrapped around her throat, and knives protruded from her chest and neck. Investigators began searching the scene, looking for anything that would tell them who had murdered Norma Davis and why. Robbery appeared to be an unlikely motive. The victim still wore an expensive ring on her finger.
It's expensive as that ring.
A few desk drawers were open, but there were no signs of ransacking. Forensic technicians processed the body, looking for any stray hairs or fibers that the killer may have left behind. But from the position of the body, it was clear to California Department of Justice criminalist Alyssa Mayo Thompson that there was little interaction between the victim and killer.
She appeared to just be sitting in her chair as if she were perhaps reading or watching TV. It didn't appear that she had made much of a struggle or had attempted to get up from that chair.
That told investigators that Norma Davis most likely knew her killer. The knives were removed and sent to the crime lab to be tested for prints. A search of the condo confirmed that robbery was not a motive. On the kitchen floor, investigators found Norma's purse, still containing credit cards and cash. In the hallway, investigators spotted a faint shoe print on the floor. To get a better look, the room was darkened. Closer examination revealed that it was a sneaker print left in dust. And recovering such fragile evidence would be tricky. But in a crime scene that yielded few clues to the killer's identity, the print could prove to be a vital piece of evidence. After thoroughly photographing the print, technicians carefully applied an adhesive gelatin to lift it. But the minute details of the print didn't survive the lift. It would be up to examiners to determine if there was a sufficient sample to do future comparisons when and if a suspect emerged. Outside, detectives talked to Alice Williams, who had found the victim. She stated that she had come over to pick up Norma for their weekly hair appointment. She let herself in when Norma didn't respond to her calls. That's when she discovered the body. She couldn't understand how such a thing could have happened in Canyon Lake. It was a gated community with round-the-clock security. Norma's ex-daughter-in-law, Mary Pierce, had also arrived at the scene. She, too, lived in Canyon Lake. She told investigators that she and Norma were very close. But as Mary continued describing Norma in greater detail, detectives glanced down and noticed she was wearing Nike sneakers. They asked if there was anyone close to Norma who would want her dead. Mary reacted with shock, insisting no relative could possibly be involved. But now, detectives weren't so sure. They turned to the crime lab for answers. But criminalists at the California Department of Justice Forensic Lab determined that all of the evidence recovered from the condo had been wiped clean of prints.
There were no stains.
They hoped the recovered shoe print could lead them to Norma's killer. For Ricky Eldon Cooksey, a criminalist with the Department of Justice Crime Lab in Riverside, shoe print evidence can carry investigators a long way.
A shoe print collected at the crime scene can help investigators if we can identify what kind of shoe made that print, and there are databases that store that type of information. We can tell them what type of shoe they're looking for and size shoe they're looking for.
After reviewing hundreds of different sneaker tread designs, Cooksey believed that the print recovered from Norma Davis's home had been made by a Nike. He acquired a similar sneaker from the manufacturer and made test prints. The tread design was identical. Cooksey had determined that the suspect's print had been made by a size 6.5 Nike Air tennis shoe. For detectives, the news was not that encouraging. Tracking down a specific purchase of such a popular shoe would be next to impossible. The only thing that homicide detective Joe Greco could infer from the analysis was that the suspect was a small male, or possibly a woman. And he already had a potential suspect who fit that description.
We suspected the ex-daughter-in-law, Mary Pierce, because of the shoes that she was wearing when she came to the crime scene. And the brand of shoe matched the brand of shoe that we found in the doorway. And also, she was the caretaker. She was the obvious choice.
The police questioned Mary Pierce in greater detail, carefully watching her demeanor.
She would take a minute.
Mary said her ex-mother-in-law was a wonderful, warm person who didn't have any enemies. Most days, she just watched her TV or read.
She was just a loose.
After answering dozens of questions, it became clear to investigators that Mary was not involved in Norma's murder. Her cooperation and her grief were sincere.
I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Detectives reviewed dozens of statements given by Norma's family, friends, and neighbors, but but no one had any useful information. The case quickly threatened to go cold. With no suspects and no solid leads, it looked like Norma Davis's murder might never be solved. In Riverside, California, the investigation into the stabbing and strangulation death of 86-year-old Norma Davis, killed in her Canyon Lake home, had ground to a halt.
Attention units, we have a possible homicide.
As investigators struggled to keep the case alive, another 911 call came in from residents of Canyon Lake. Another elderly woman had been found murdered in her home. There, police discovered 66-year-old June Roberts, dead on her office floor. And for everyone in the room, this crime scene looked disturbingly familiar. Though June Roberts had not been stabbed, she still wore an expensive ring and had a phone cord wrapped around her neck. Credit cards were scattered around her purse, but nothing appeared to be missing.
Now that is so strange.
For criminalist Alyssa Mayo Thompson, it was obvious that June Roberts and Norma Davis's murders were connected.
The type of crimes, both brutal homicides occurring within a few short days between each other in this area, led us to think that these two crimes may be linked.
Investigators scoured the home.
Oh, the jealous senior.
Inside was a handwritten prayer list.
Someone got jealous.
Norma Davis's name was on that list. The two victims were friends. But for Detective Greco, how they were connected to the killer was unclear. He could be certain about one thing, however. A serial killer was targeting elderly women in Canyon Lake.
This whole case is overwhelming in that it's not something that one in law enforcement comes across every day. It's a crime of serious violence, and it wasn't stopping. I mean, it was just the beginning.
And so far, this killer had made few mistakes. But a week after June Roberts' death, that all seemed to change. June Roberts' daughter brought police a statement from one of her mother's credit card companies. Someone had gone on a spending spree immediately after June's death, charging jewelry, clothing, and other merchandise. It was the break detectives were waiting for. Now they had a paper trail to follow. They started at a jewelry store, where the first purchase with the murdered victim's card had been made. The clerk vaguely recalled the transaction. She remembered that a blonde woman came into the store and purchased an expensive set of earrings. The woman charged the items and signed her name, June Roberts. The clerk couldn't provide enough detail for a composite sketch, but she gave investigators a Xerox copy of an identical pair of earrings. The blonde woman, whoever she was, had been linked to one of the victims. The next purchase on June Roberts' credit card came from a hair salon. A stylist there remembered the woman claiming to be June Roberts. She said the woman was in her mid-30s, with shoulder-length blonde hair, hazel eyes, and a medium build. She added that the woman had a young boy with her. According to her appointment book, his name was Jonathan Weaver. An artist was brought in to translate the stylist's description of the blonde woman into a composite sketch. Gradually, a face took shape.
Yes. What would you change it?
But police still didn't know how this woman fit into the murders, and they had no way to put a name to her face. Pursuing their only other lead, investigators began searching for the young boy, Jonathan Weaver, who had been at the hair salon with the blonde woman. They contacted area public schools and found a child with that name. They went to his address and waited. But when they spotted the boy and his mother arriving home, they realized the mother didn't resemble any of the descriptions. Questioning confirmed that the boy had never been to that salon, and neither recognized the woman in the composite.
No, I've never seen her.
Despite the setback, investigators refused to give up. The locations of the murders and the credit card purchases were all within a 5-mile radius of each other. Investigators knew their killer had to be hiding right under their noses.
She made more purchases there. Yeah, she made
Hoping to generate a lead, they decided to run a check of all violent crimes recently reported within that same area. The tactic turned up a possible clue. An elderly woman who owned an antique shop just blocks away from Canyon Lake had been recently assaulted.
Yeah. Yeah, I
During the
just
hospital,
don't store.
still recovering in the
I
hospital,
don't want to
had barely survived the attack.
I know. Okay.
She told investigators that the blonde woman came into her antique shop to ask about framing.
Just closed my eyes.
When she led the customer into the back to show her some samples, the woman suddenly attacked her from behind. Dorinda felt a rope tightening around her neck.
So
she told detectives that she then began begging for her life.
No, I don't have to watch
you can have whatever you want, take whatever you want. I have 8 children, let me live. And the suspect told her, I'm not doing this for the money.
Dorinda had been left for dead, but she managed to regain consciousness.
I turned it on for
When
Jackie.
Her
Oh, no?
key band that held the keys to the cash register was missing from her wrist. And the money from the register was also gone. When shown the composite, she positively identified the blonde as her assailant. Yes. It was now apparent to investigators that the suspect was not simply an accessory to the other crimes. She was the serial killer. And the rarest type of all, a woman. Investigators raced to put a name with the face on the composite sketch. Since Mary Pierce had known both of the murder victims, police hoped she might have also crossed paths with the killer.
Let me ask you this, can you put a name to this face? Does this look familiar?
When shown the sketch, Mary said that the face kind of resembled her stepdaughter, Dana Sue Gray.
That's my stepdaughter.
As Mary described her stepdaughter, the pieces started to fall into place.
The information fit the description of the suspect that I was looking for, in that she had a key to the first victim's house. She knew the second victim. She had a pass to get into Canyon Lake, and she was familiar with the area.
Mary added that Dana owned a house in Canyon Lake.
So you do know those?
But Dana had just gone through a vicious divorce battle and was trying to sell the place because of the resulting financial ruin. Her job as a registered nurse was not enough to support the affluent lifestyle she had come to enjoy. The positive identification of the sketch and the information provided by Mary Pierce led detectives to obtain a warrant to search Dana Sue Gray's property. But that would take time. And given the suspect's propensity for violence, They didn't want to give her a chance to kill again. Undercover officers immediately put her under surveillance. Riverside County investigators continued looking into Dana Sue Gray's background. They learned that she was currently dating a man who had a young child named Jonathan Weaver, the same name as the child who had been at the hair salon. But this Jonathan Weaver was enrolled in private school. Previously, detectives had only searched public school records. Later that afternoon, one of the officers picked up Dana's trail in nearby Sun City as she entered a bank. When she left a few minutes later, Dana was seen stuffing a large amount of cash into her purse. A few hours later, Riverside police had obtained their search warrant. Detective Greco briefed the team on the items of evidence they were looking for once they made their way inside the suspect's house.
We had receipts from the different locations that the purchases were made for these various items, so they knew exactly what they were looking for. Also, I had directed the searchers to collect all of the shoes within the residence because of obviously the first victim's the shoe print in the first victim's case.
In the early evening hours of March 16, 1994, Riverside County investigators took suspected serial killer Dana Sue Gray into custody. She was taken to the Riverside Police Station for questioning. Inside the residence, investigators uncovered a wealth of evidence. They located a red-coiled key wristband, identical to the one stolen from Dorinda Hawkins at the antique shop. They also found merchandise similar to items purchased with June Roberts' credit cards. Inside Dana's purse, police made an ominous discovery. There was $1,900 in cash and a checkbook in the name of Dora Beebe. The address on the checks was from Sun City. Though Dora Beebe's name meant nothing to investigators, they knew that Dana Sue Gray had been in Sun City earlier that day. The search continued into the bedroom. There, evidence technicians found a pair of Nike sneakers. The evidence was sent to the crime lab.
Hey, you understand why you're here, don't you?
At the police station, Dana Sue Gray appeared calm and unaffected. She denied killing or assaulting anyone.
I think it looks exactly like
She admitted using credit cards belonging to June and another woman, whose name she couldn't remember, but claimed she had found them lying next to a dumpster.
You know what? Can I see those earrings?
Investigators collected Dana's earrings, which appeared to be the ones purchased on June Roberts' credit card.
These look very familiar to me.
As the detective left the interview to process the earrings, another investigator was waiting to speak to him outside. There had been another murder. The MO was identical to the Norma Davis and June Roberts homicides. The latest victim had been killed earlier that day in her home, which was located in Sun City. Riverside, California police believed that the suspect in the murders of Norma Davis and June Roberts was finally in their custody. As they questioned Dana Sue Gray about the murders, detectives were informed that Dora Beebe, an elderly resident in nearby Sun City, had been found murdered. That crime scene bore the same signature as the other homicides in Canyon Lake. Detectives realized they had found cash and a checkbook in the name of Dora Beebe while searching Dana's house.
Is there anything else you may want to
Dana Sue Gray had killed again, just a short while before the surveillance on her began.
Jim Roberts' credit cards in the dumpster too.
Now, they needed to be certain that she would never be free to kill again. At the crime lab, examiners analyzed the sneakers recovered from Dana Sue Gray's bedroom. They were size 6.5 Nike Air sneakers, the same style and size as the print recovered from the Norma Davis crime scene. Analysis of the characteristics that distinguish one shoe print from another left investigators with little doubt that Dana Sue Gray's shoes had left the print in Norma's condo. Unable to explain away all of the evidence amassed against her, Dana Sue Gray had no choice but to confess to her crimes. Riverside County investigators believe that Dana Sue Gray was driven over the edge by her financial misfortunes that resulted from her divorce. Angry and envious, she chose affluent victims, sometimes strangers, but mostly friends and relatives, as targets for murder. To avoid the death penalty, Dana Sue Gray pled guilty to the multiple murders. She was given 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole.
When I think of Dana Sue Gray, the first thing that comes to mind, for me anyway, is evil. It's just evil.
There are usually patterns to serial murder, though they're often hard to detect. Only time, patience, and meticulous forensic science can delve into the unknown and finally bring them to light. But ultimately, that's what detectives need to stop the killers who are driven by bloodlust. In Florida, a young woman is hit by a train. But what looks like a suicide might be a killer covering his tracks. A woman disappears from her Arizona home. With no body, police must rely on a few drops of blood to determine her fate. In California, police are called to the scene of a grisly double homicide. Only forensic examiners can prove whether it was the result of self-defense or cold-blooded murder. Some killers go to great lengths to manipulate a crime scene. But the truth is hard to disguise, and forensic examiners can see through the deception, especially when it's written in tainted blood. Around 4 a.m. on December 5, 1993, a freight train was passing through the small community of Crestview, Florida. On an isolated stretch, the engineer noticed something lying across the tracks up ahead. It looked like a human body. He frantically sounded the whistle and struggled to stop the train. Underneath the 120-ton train, he discovered the lifeless body of a woman. The engineer quickly radioed in for help. Within minutes, police and emergency personnel from the Crestview Police Department were dispatched to the scene. The young female victim had suffered massive head and chest wounds. She was partially covered by a black trench coat that was stained with blood. Police began searching for any form of identification to tell them who this woman was. They found nothing. Blood found pooled on the tracks and on some rocks just feet away from where the victim came to rest suggested the impact point. A few hairs and tiny drops of blood were found at the front of the train. But investigators found no blood smears on the tracks leading up to the victim's body. When questioned, the engineer told police that as he worked to stop the train, he believed that he made eye contact with the woman lying on the tracks. She never even flinched as the train approached. She just seemed to be staring at him. Before leaving the scene, evidence technicians photographed the area. At autopsy, the medical examiner determined the cause of death to be severe trauma to the unidentified victim's head and chest. She had suffered multiple skull fractures and a broken rib. To the medical examiner, all of the injuries were consistent with having been caused by the train. With no obvious signs of foul play noted during autopsy, investigators began looking for other explanations behind the tragedy. For Chief Maxie Barrow, there seemed to be only one.
We were thinking that it could possibly be a suicide. It could be somebody who was depressed and laid down on the railroad track and let a train run over.
To confirm their suspicions, investigators first had to identify the young woman. Several local residents believed she was 24-year-old Sherry Morrow, who lived with her husband less than a mile from the train tracks. Police went to the address. There, they were met by John Morrow, Sherry's husband, and the couple's roommate. Investigators showed the husband a photograph of the victim. John Morrow couldn't believe what he was seeing. The woman lying dead on the railroad tracks was his wife, Sherry. Morrow said that he and Sherry fought the night before. She believed he was flirting with another woman who was at a party at the couple's house. She became enraged. John followed her outside, determined to convince her that she was mistaken. They walked up the street to a payphone. She was cold, so John gave her his trench coat. Despite his efforts, Sherry remained angry and seemed depressed. John returned home, believing the best thing he could do would be to leave her alone. He thought that Sherry called a friend to come pick her up. John never imagined that she would take her own life. The couple's roommate corroborated John's story. The husband's account, in addition to the autopsy finding, left investigators with no reason to doubt the suicide theory. The investigation into Sherry Morrow's death was ready to be closed. The following day, however, Sherry Morrow's mother came in to speak with police.
Your daughter was married?
She could not accept that her daughter had taken her own life. John, she said, had had numerous affairs that Sherry found out about. As a result, Sherry had decided to end the turbulent marriage. Recently, she'd begun searching for her own place so she could be closer to her mother. And though Sherry was upset to learn of her husband's infidelities, her mother was certain that she would never have killed herself. In fact, Sherry was prepared for a costly divorce, which John desperately wanted to avoid.
It's not unusual for the family of a suicide victim to determine that, or to say that they didn't commit suicide. But in the case of this victim, her mother was pretty convincing to me that that this victim didn't do that and wouldn't have done that.
Despite their new suspicions, investigators found no evidence suggesting that Sherry Morrow had met with foul play. Almost a month after she was discovered along the railroad tracks, the young woman was laid to rest. Over the next several years, investigators interviewed dozens of Sherry's friends looking to uncover proof that she had been murdered. But they found nothing. The investigation into Sherry Morrow's death ground to a halt. The case was handed over to Crestview Police Lieutenant Jerome Worley. Determined to breathe new life into the investigation, he began re-interviewing the couple's friends and associates, starting with their roommate. The roommate again corroborated the story John had given 2 years earlier. On the night Sherry died, he said John followed her after she stormed out of the house in anger. But he returned soon after and never left the house again. Detectives sensed that the roommate wasn't telling the truth. Under threat of prosecution, he changed his story. John, he said, was sick of his wife, and he often bragged about how easy it would be to kill her and to make her death look like a suicide or an accident. He said that on the night Sherry died, John was gone for hours after leaving with her. When he returned, John was agitated. His knuckles were red. And he told the roommate, "It's done." Though the roommate's testimony confirmed investigators' suspicions that John Morrow was involved in his wife's death, Lieutenant Worley knew it wouldn't be enough to prove murder.
Well, the roommate would be contradicting himself with a new statement, and it would just be his word against the husband's word in court. So we knew we'd have to have some physical evidence to prove the case.
But with the victim laid to rest and little evidence recovered from the scene, finding proof of murder would not be easy. For nearly 3 years, police in Crestview, Florida, struggled to make sense of the death of 24-year-old Sherry Morrow. Though all of the evidence suggested she had taken her own life by lying in front of an oncoming train, investigators suspected that her husband, John Morrow, had murdered her. But they didn't have a shred of proof. Investigators forwarded what little evidence they had to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Crime Lab in Pensacola. There, examiner Jan Johnson, an expert in bloodstain pattern interpretation, began examining photographs of the scene and the victim's clothes. Starting at the place where Sherry was struck by the train, Johnson began analyzing the bloodstains.
Generally speaking, if you would have a body lying on a railroad track and the body's still, there's no movement. So therefore, when the train would strike the victim, you would have spattered blood at that point of impact.
But in the photographs, there was no blood spatter at that spot. The blood was pooled. For Johnson, the only way to explain the findings was that Sherry was already bleeding when she laid down on the tracks. The lack of any blood smeared along the tracks leading up to Sherry's body was also troubling.
If it was a train striking a woman lying on the railroad tracks, I would expect to see a trail of blood leading from the point of impact to the final resting place.
In fact, no bleeding had occurred from any of the wounds caused by the train. That would only make sense if she was dead at the point of impact.
Once your heart stops, the blood flow ceases. So therefore, any injury that occurs after that fact, you will have very little bloodshed.
But if the train hadn't killed her, the question remained, what had? To find out, Johnson began analyzing the bloodstains found on the victim's clothes. She found blood spatter on the victim's t-shirt that didn't correspond to any of the head injuries noted in the original autopsy report. The size and the location of the spatter on the t-shirt was consistent with a specific type of injury.
If I had not known this was a train case and just received the clothing solely alone in the laboratory, I would have clearly thought someone had been beaten just by looking at the clothing. Because, again, we've got the spatter pattern on the t-shirt, and this would be consistent with someone being beaten, stabbed, something of that nature.
Johnson passed on her findings to Crestview Police. The forensic analysis convinced detectives that Sherry Morrow had been murdered. To take this case before a jury, however, they needed to find the fatal injuries that had somehow gone unnoticed years earlier. 3 years after she was laid to rest, Sherry's remains were exhumed and forwarded to the medical examiner for a second autopsy. A new medical examiner began looking for evidence of homicide. On the back of the victim's skull, he found injuries consistent with blunt force trauma. And the wounds were not consistent with any of the injuries caused by the train. Medical examiner Dr. Michael Berkland next reviewed the original autopsy photos looking for any other abnormalities. He noticed strange bruising on the victim's neck that had not been noted in the original autopsy report. X-rays revealed the presence of a broken hyoid, a bone in the neck located at the base of the tongue. Dr. Berkland didn't believe that the train could have caused the injury.
It would be extremely unlikely that the train could have struck her in such a way to fracture the hyoid and leave the jaw intact, because it is such a protected structure up high in the neck, back behind the jawbone.
The most reasonable explanation for the broken hyoid was that Sherry Morrow had been strangled. The blunt force trauma injuries found on the skull and the broken hyoid bone gave investigators the evidence they needed to prove that Sherry Morrow had been the victim of a homicide. And though investigators suspected that her husband, John Morrow, had committed the murder, they needed to find a way to link him to the crime scene. Though several years had gone by, police tracked down all of the railroad engineers who had passed through the area on the night Sherry was murdered. One immediately recognized photographs of John and Sherry Morrow. The couple, he said, were walking dangerously close to the tracks. They appeared to be having a bitter argument and seemed oblivious to his warnings. The engineers specifically remembered that the man, identified as John Morrow, had been wearing a black trench coat. On April 29, 1997, John Morrow was placed under arrest and charged with first-degree murder. Though he maintained his innocence, police believed that when Sherry decided to end the marriage, the stress of a divorce was too much for him to bear. As the couple argued while walking along the railroad tracks, John grabbed a blunt instrument and struck Sherry in the back of the head. But when she failed to lose consciousness, he finished the job by beating and then strangling her. breaking her hyoid bone in the process. Then he laid her bleeding body on the tracks and covered her with a blood-spattered trench coat. Sherry likely died within a few minutes. A jury convicted John Morrow of murder and sentenced him to life in prison without parole. John Morrow tried to deceive investigators by disguising his victim's cause of death. In a suburban community just north of Phoenix, Arizona, investigators would have to prove murder without the victim's body. On the evening of June 4th, 1989, Maricopa County Sheriff's deputies were called to the home of Earl and Ruby Morris. The couple's daughter, Cindy, was concerned that something had happened to her 49-year-old mother, Ruby. The two had made plans to meet that day, but Ruby failed to show up. When Cindy stopped by to check on her, she found her parents' bedroom was unusually messy.
This is all wrong. And as soon as I saw that,
And she noticed that their .22 caliber handgun was missing.
Your mom or dad doing a recreational shoot?
She said that her father, Earl, was currently in Los Angeles, California, but he would be back early the next day. But by the following morning, neither Ruby nor her husband, Earl, had returned home. Maricopa County Sheriff's Lieutenant Lee Luganbuehl was asked to look into the case. After reviewing the daughter's statements, he agreed to open a missing persons investigation.
Well, the daughter, Cindy, is supposed to meet her for lunch that day, and she never showed up. And this was kind of unusual for Mom. Mom was a very prompt person, would always meet her appointments, and she was very neat around the house also. So there were some things that were out of place at the house that was just not like Ruby.
Later that afternoon, the detective returned to the Morris residence to interview family members. When asked about her mother and father's relationship, Cindy told police that her parents' 30-year marriage had turned ugly in recent months.
what is this, Earl?
Earl had been caught having an affair. Upset and angry, Ruby began threatening to end the marriage and vowed to financially ruin her husband. Earl, a successful 49-year-old accountant, promised her that would never happen. But Cindy couldn't imagine that her father was capable of physical violence. As the questioning continued, Earl Morris returned from his trip. Cindy commented that he wasn't driving his own car. Earl explained that his car, an El Camino, had broken down some 200 miles from home on the drive back from Los Angeles. After several hours stranded on the road, he managed to hitch a ride to Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport. There, Earl said he rented a car to get home. But almost immediately, the detective was suspicious of Earl's story.
I looked at his clothes and his general demeanor too. He was neat. He didn't appear to be out, trying to flag down a car. He was all put together.
The detective also noticed new airport tags on Earl's luggage, suggesting he had flown, not driven, from California. And the luggage tags originated from San Diego, not Los Angeles. With his suspicions raised, the investigator questioned Earl about Ruby's disappearance. Though he couldn't explain why the couple's .22 caliber gun was missing, he seemed unconcerned about his wife's whereabouts. Ruby, he said, would often take off for days on end without a word.
Earl told me he didn't think it was unusual for Ruby to be gone for a couple days, that she had the wherewithal, credit card, be able to go out, visit other people, and to leave. So he, again, was saying, like, it was no big deal that she was gone.
Investigators felt different. Looking to corroborate Earl's story, they began searching the interstates for his broken-down El Camino. But hours of driving turned up no signs of the vehicle. There were no records of it having been towed. An APB was issued for the car. A short while later, Earl Morris's El Camino was located. It was found nearly 400 miles away, parked near the San Diego airport. San Diego authorities impounded the vehicle and arranged for it to be transported back to Arizona.
All right, thanks. Bye.
For investigators, it was now clear that Earl Morris's story was a lie. To find out what he was hiding, they obtained a search warrant. That evening, police returned to his residence. Having observed no obvious signs of foul play, investigators began scouring the bedroom for trace amounts of evidence. They discovered several bloodstains on the carpet near the bed. Maricopa County Sheriff's Crime Lab supervisor, James Serpa, noticed something odd about their appearance.
We saw visible signs that the carpet nap in the master suite had been disturbed in a circular pattern, which could indicate the use of a carpet cleaner.
Technicians also found a fine mist of blood spatter on the headboard of the couple's bed. The evidence was collected and forwarded to the crime lab for analysis. For investigators, the discovery of so much blood was not encouraging.
The amount of blood in the master suite was a significant amount of blood, and someone would have been at least direly wounded, if not deceased.
Though investigators believed that someone was Ruby Morris, they soon learned that the blood recovered from the house was too degraded for a definitive DNA analysis. Technicians began scouring Earl Morris's vehicle for clues. The search revealed the presence of several large bloodstains on the passenger side carpet. The samples were collected and sent out for DNA testing. Though the analysis would take time, police speculated that Earl Morris had murdered his wife, then transported her body in his El Camino. And that meant Ruby's body could be anywhere between Phoenix and San Diego. As investigators began the daunting task of trying to pinpoint Ruby's remains, one of the couple's daughters came forward with information. Earl owned a boat, and he kept it docked in San Diego. Believing there had to be a connection, police contacted authorities there. A few days later, San Diego Harbor Police forwarded a video cassette to Maricopa County investigators. The tape, shot the same day that Ruby was reported missing, showed a boat burning at sea. And authorities had positively identified it as belonging to Earl Morris. For detectives, the significance was clear.
We speculated that Earl rented another boat to tow out his boat and actually set it on fire to hide the body of Ruby and also the murder weapon at that time.
The boat ultimately sank in treacherous waters too deep to be recovered. Despite the clumsy lies Earl Morris was telling police, it looked like he just might get away with murder. Detectives in Maricopa County, Arizona, were convinced that Earl Morris had murdered his 49-year-old wife, Ruby, and then entombed her in a watery grave several hundred miles away off the California coast. But without a weapon or the victim's body, they would have to rely on the forensic evidence to prove murder. And first, they would have to show that blood found in Earl's El Camino belonged to his wife. With no known samples from Ruby to compare to the evidence, examiners turned to a process called reverse paternity typing. which isolates strands of DNA that pass unchanged from mother to child. Maricopa County Sheriff's Crime Lab Supervisor James Serpa then compared the genetic profile of the samples collected from the El Camino to those generated from Ruby's 2 daughters and from her siblings.
The blood stain on the carpet of the El Camino was the mother of Ruby's children and the sibling of Ruby's brother and sister.
Though their case was largely circumstantial, investigators arrested Earl Morris and charged him with murder. Through his lawyer, Earl refused to make any statements. As the trial approached, investigators struggled to come up with more incriminating evidence against Earl Morris. But they found little else. Then, word came in that Earl Morris wanted to talk. He admitted he had been lying to authorities, but he said it wasn't to cover up his wife's murder. Ruby, he said, had killed herself. Earl said that in the early morning hours of June 4th, he entered the master bedroom and found Ruby dead, clutching the couple's .22 caliber pistol in her hand. Blood was everywhere. Wanting to spare the family the embarrassment of the suicide, he cleaned up the room and drove her body to San Diego, where he then disposed of the remains. He thought it would be easier for the family to accept that Ruby had decided to just up and leave. Though the account sounded ridiculous to police, they realized that Earl's suicide story had the potential to create reasonable doubt in the minds of jurors. Unless investigators could come up with hard evidence to prove otherwise, Earl Morris could be a free man. And without the ability to examine the victim's body, it would be difficult to disprove Earl's story. Lieutenant Commander Rod Englert, an expert in bloodstain pattern analysis, was brought in to assist in the investigation. Englert and Serpa began by re-examining the headboard collected from the couple's bedroom. When luminol was applied, Englert had no doubt that the blood spatter present, which appeared as fine mist, had resulted from a specific type of injury.
Well, when there's crimes of violence, blood is categorized into 3 major categories. The low category, which is termed low velocity impact spatters, just drops of blood, smears of blood, transfer stains. The second category is from blunt trauma, which is termed medium velocity. And the third category, which we're dealing with in this particular case, is high velocity, which is a specific, easily identified pattern, which is atomization of blood. And that comes from gunshot.
The location of the spatter on the headboard also allowed examiners to determine the position of the victim's head at the time she was shot. Ruby had been lying flat in a sleep-like position.
If that's the case, and if this is...
Though the finding was suspicious, on its own it did not contradict Earl Morris's suicide story. After thoroughly photographing the bloodstains, Englert began looking for any abnormalities in the patterns. Something immediately caught his attention.
As you look at the headboard, a left to right direction, you have a pattern of blood going up that direction. You have another pattern of blood overlapping it and going in another direction. So you have there 2 conditions that don't occur at the same time.
The bloodstain patterns indicated that Ruby had been shot at least twice. And if she had taken her own life, as Earl claimed, that would have been difficult to do.
Well, first of all, Ruby Morris would have to have been able to cock the hammer on the gun, which I'm told was a single action revolver .22, after a shot to the head to a large source of blood. Would have to be able to cock it again and possibly even a third time.
And that's not likely.
Investigators agreed. Based on the forensic analysis, there could be little doubt that Ruby Morris had been murdered. Police believe that to avoid the financial ruin from a divorce, Earl Morris chose to kill his wife. As Ruby lay sleeping in the couple's bed, he pulled out the .22 caliber pistol and shot her several times in the head. After cleaning up the crime scene, he loaded her bleeding body into his El Camino and drove several hundred miles away to San Diego. Once there, he loaded her body and likely the murder weapon onto his boat. He set the craft on fire, returned to shore, and began the process of covering up his crime. With the help of Rod Englert's blood spatter analysis, Earl Morris was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Earl Morris tried to explain his wife's death by creating a story about suicide. But sometimes murderers admit killing their victims. And the story they tell investigators is one of self-defense. Around 1:30 a.m. on October 18, 1984, the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department received a frantic 911 call. 24-year-old Brett Harris said that his mother, Barbara, had been murdered. His stepfather, Bob Giesler, was also dead. Distraught, Brett was threatening to take his own life. Sacramento County Sheriff's deputies raced to the scene. As they approached the house, they made a bizarre discovery. A man, identified as Brett Harris, was hiding in a tree. After talking him down, one of the officers made his way into the residence.
Come on over here. Come on out.
In the master bedroom, he discovered a gruesome scene. A woman lay dead on the mattress. And on the floor nearby was another lifeless body. Officers from the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department were dispatched to the home of 52-year-old Bob Giesler and his 55-year-old wife, Barbara. The couple had been brutally murdered. Investigators questioned Barbara's son, Brett Harris, who had called 911. After some time, he was able to recount what had happened. Brett said that around 1:30 a.m., he heard a commotion, and then a scream coming from his parents' bedroom. When he entered their room, he saw his stepfather standing above his lifeless mother. He saw an axe handle lying on the floor. As he went to grab it, his stepfather then attacked him with a box cutter. Brett said he managed to overpower him, and in self-defense, he beat his stepfather to death. The young man was transported to the police station. Evidence technicians made their way into the bedroom. According to crime scene unit investigator Brian Kennedy, both victims had been savagely beaten.
Their heads and faces were grotesquely disfigured, and there were bloodstains all over every surface. At one time, the air must have been filled with atomized mist or droplets of blood falling out of the air. It was quite a horrendous sight.
Technicians began looking for evidence to help them reconstruct what had happened inside the room. In addition to the axe handle, investigators also recovered a blood-stained box cutter found resting on Bob Giesler's chest. All of the bloodstain patterns were carefully photographed. As the search of the house continued, officers followed a trail of bloody shoe prints that led from the bedroom to the kitchen. The trail stopped in front of an opened utility drawer. Unsure what to make of the findings, officers created a visual record of the evidence. At the police station, investigators struggled to obtain coherent answers from Brett Harris. He was unresponsive to their questions and began rambling on about the devil and other things that made little sense. Officers photographed several superficial wounds on his body. Police also collected his blood-stained clothes. With so many unanswered questions, police hoped autopsies of the victims could tell them more. The medical examiner concluded that Bob and Barbara Giesler had both died from massive blunt force trauma to the skull. The beatings had been so savage that both the victims' arms had been broken while defending themselves during the assaults. Special Assistant Attorney General David Drewliner followed the investigation. For him, the autopsy findings were troubling.
The viciousness with which the two individuals were killed, Harris's mother and his stepfather, was extremely similar. And so had the stepfather been the killer of his own wife, and then Harris been the killer of the stepfather, you wouldn't have expected necessarily it to have been in such an identical manner.
Authorities couldn't ignore the possibility that one person committed both murders. If Brett Harris was responsible for the vicious double homicide, investigators needed to find out what could have motivated such rage. They turned to family members for information. Brett's stepsister told detectives that her stepmother and father had always maintained a good relationship with Brett. Though Brett would sometimes find himself facing legal problems, his mother and stepfather would always look out for him, bailing him out of jail on a number of occasions. Brett's stepfather even employed him at his tool-making company in hopes that the young man would find himself. Though Brett suffered from a psychiatric condition, his stepsister said that he had made progress in recent months, and with the help of medications, his prospects for the future were promising.
No.
She added that Bob and Barbara's relationship was strong, and she could not imagine that her father would ever hurt her stepmother. Nothing investigators had learned jived with Brett Harris's version of events. Believing the 24-year-old was hiding something, they turned to examiners at the Sacramento County Sheriff's Crime Lab for answers. There, examiner Brian Kennedy looked to the blood evidence to help him reconstruct the crime.
This was an interesting case where we had 3 people in a house where only one person came out alive, and he had a story. The story was not completely and totally impossible. In piecing it all together, I tried to support his story. I actually looked at it to see if I could prove him correct.
But in one of the photographs taken in the bedroom, Kennedy noticed something odd. Though the entire room had been saturated with the victim's blood, the carpet underneath the stepfather's body was clean. For Kennedy, there seemed to be only one way to explain that fact.
He goes down onto the floor, and he's incapacitated and shields the floor from any blood that would come from his wife. And so we know that he's down first because she's then attacked and her blood covers the rest of the room. And we can we can put her blood on top of him, but we can't put it underneath him.
The finding contradicted Brett's story that his mother had already been bludgeoned and was bleeding by the time he entered the room. With the evidence now pointing to Brett Harris as his mother's killer, Kennedy began analyzing bloodstains on his clothing for proof. But serological tests showed that all the blood on his clothes had originated from the stepfather. Kennedy now wondered if it was possible for Brett to have bludgeoned his mother while avoiding getting her blood on him. To find out, he devised a blood spatter experiment. Simulating the assailant's position, he began striking sponges soaked with blood with a wooden instrument, looking to see how the resulting blood spatter would stain his clothing. The result surprised him.
The first couple blows, I actually turned my head to the side, so I wouldn't get a full face of spatter. And I found out I wasn't getting anything. I just started relaxing and letting it go. I started beating it even harder, and it was all going out to the sides. Very little was coming back at me, if any.
Kennedy had successfully demonstrated that Barbara's assailant could have avoided being spattered by her blood. And coupled with the other findings, it was clear that Brett Harris's story was a lie.
So the bottom line is, the two deceased people who couldn't speak for themselves spoke volumes with the bloodstain patterns that were produced from them. And I was unable to support or substantiate anything that the defendant had said.
After being charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, Brett Harris underwent a psychiatric evaluation. He now admitted to both killings, but claimed it was in self-defense. After explaining that his parents were possessed by warlocks, Brett Harris entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. Though Brett had been previously diagnosed with a mental condition, prosecutors believed the story he was now telling was just a desperate attempt to escape justice.
He wasn't insane. And by that I mean, did he know what he was doing? Did he know that he actually was killing human beings? And did he know that it was wrong? And there was no doubt as to the answer to those questions was yes and yes. He knew it was wrong. Otherwise, why did he call 911 immediately after it? He knew it was a crime.
But to win a murder conviction, authorities needed to find physical proof that the cold-blooded murders were not the result of an insane mind. Forensic examiners in Sacramento, California, had proven that 24-year-old Brett Harris had brutally bludgeoned his mother and stepfather to death. After being charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, the suspect told psychiatrists that warlocks possessed both Bob and Barbara Giesler, and he killed the couple in self-defense. Brett Harris entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. To prove that he was lying in order to avoid the death penalty, authorities turned once again to the forensic evidence. Examiner Brian Kennedy began looking at all the physical evidence recovered from the crime scene, looking for anything that could demonstrate that Brett Harris knew what he was doing at the time of the murders. He focused on the box cutter found on Bob Giesler's chest. After reviewing the autopsy reports, Kennedy believed it was unlikely that the box cutter could have been used as a weapon against Brett, as he had previously claimed.
Both of our victims had broken arms. If you're defending yourself with your arms and you've got it holding something and it's severe enough to break the arm, you're going to lose control of whatever's in your hand, most likely. I doubt seriously you could hang on to it. For somebody to have their arm broken and then place it on their chest is not likely.
Believing that Brett Harris had staged the crime scene to throw investigators off his trail, Kennedy next looked for a way to explain the box cutter wounds found on his body.
This looks like somebody has self-inflicted these injuries because they're in the right place. For a right-handed person to cut himself on the left arm, to cut himself on the right cheek, to cut himself from left to right across his chest. So it's all very consistent with staging his own injuries.
The forensic findings provided irrefutable proof that Brett Harris had gone to great lengths to conceal his guilt. And for prosecutors, those are not the actions of an insane man.
He physically changed the crime scene in anticipation that the police are coming to the crime scene. So he tries to fool law enforcement. Why do it? Why come up with any sort of explanation? He wouldn't have to.
Though unsure of the motive, police believe that on October 18, 1984, Brett Harris snuck into the couple's room as they slept in their bed. Using an axe handle, he bludgeoned Bob and Barbara Giesler to death. After finishing the kill, he made his way into the kitchen, sliced himself with a box cutter he took from the utility drawer, and returned to the bedroom to plant the evidence. Confronted with the evidence, Brett Harris withdrew his insanity defense. He pled guilty to 1 count of first-degree murder and 1 count of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 41 years to life. Killers skilled at the art of deception hope to confuse investigators by manipulating a crime scene. But forensic experts can find justice for victims of homicide by seeing through a murderer's lies, which are written in tainted blood. In Pennsylvania, a missing persons case quickly turns into a homicide investigation. Only a piece of rope can link a suspect to the murder. Detectives in Washington state discover a family brutally murdered. To expose the killer, forensic examiners look to the victim's own blood. A 13-year-old boy in Phoenix, Arizona, vanishes without a trace. With no body and little physical evidence, investigators struggle to make their case. When juveniles commit murder, homicide detectives enter a realm of twisted logic. They turn to forensic examiners to follow the evidence, not the excuses. When promising lives become wasted youth. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. Cambria County lies in the rural northeastern highlands of Pennsylvania. It's a small, tight-knit community that experiences few violent crimes. But on November 6, 1997, Ronald Klotz discovered that his son was missing. He told police that his 15-year-old son, Micah Pollock, never returned home from school that day. He said he and his son were very close, and it was unlike Micah to take off and not check in. Mr. Klotz explained that Micah had come to live with him the previous spring. He had moved to Pennsylvania from Ohio, where he had been living with his mother. Micah seemed happy in his new home and was enjoying making new friends. Ronald Klotz's ex-wife said she hadn't heard from Micah in some time. Though teenage boys often run away from home, Detective Greg Batcher of the Pennsylvania State Police soon learned it was unlikely that this was the case with Micah.
As we began to talk to his friends, they said that he wouldn't do that. They said that he was not the kind of person who would just up and leave. He had no reason to up and leave, and that's when the suspicion began.
Investigators learned that the missing teenager had recently begun dating a girl from school. When questioned, the girl told police that on the day Micah disappeared, he told her he was going hunting with 16-year-old Andrew Callahan. That surprised her. Andrew Callahan was her ex-boyfriend, and he seemed to resent Micah. She explained that when she and Andrew broke up, she began seeing Micah. But Andrew was possessive and had even threatened Micah on a few occasions. Andrew couldn't seem to let go.
He was very jealous, very demanding of her, and it just, according to her, that he was just, watching her all the time. He did not want her to be with someone else.
She wasn't sure if Micah had actually gone on the hunting trip with Andrew that day. Several days passed with no word from the teenager. Police, friends, and neighbors organized a search of the area surrounding Micah's home. But their efforts turned up no clues to the missing boy's whereabouts. Desperate for a lead, police set up a roadblock nearby and questioned passing motorists. Though it seemed like a long shot, the effort paid off. A man recognized a photograph of Micah. He was in the area a few days before, and while pulled over in his vehicle, he had seen Micah with another teenager. They were heading toward an abandoned strip mine. The boy with Micah carried a shotgun over his shoulder. He thought the other teenager could have been Andrew Callahan. The next day, police and forensic technicians followed up on the lead. They traveled to the strip mines where the motorist had seen the two teenagers a few days earlier. Recent heavy rains made searching the area for clues a challenge. But soon after the search began, investigators found something that seemed out of place. It was a trash can in relatively good condition. Technicians found several red droplets on the can. They tested positive for blood. Investigators preserved the murky rainwater from inside the can for further testing. A search of the surrounding area failed to yield any additional clues. All of the evidence was forwarded to forensic examiners. At the Pennsylvania State Police Crime Lab, criminalist Bruce Tackett first needed to determine if the bloodstains in the trash can had originated from an animal or a human. Using a chemical that reacts to proteins in human blood by turning pink, Tackett concluded the blood was human. But to generate a genetic profile from the evidence, Tackett would need additional samples. The remaining stains were too degraded for a more comprehensive analysis. Though there was a chance that blood was present within the liquid contents of the trash can, he realized that the rainwater had likely diluted it. The only way to extract remaining blood proteins would be to first remove the water from the sample. Tackett poured the liquid into a pan and then placed it in an evaporation chamber. In this dry environment, with an air current passing over the sample, the liquid was slowly removed and the solids became more concentrated. After most of the water had evaporated, Tackett tested the sample to see if there was any blood protein in the residue. He couldn't detect any, but he did find a potentially valuable piece of trace evidence. A single strand of human hair. Though there was no way to confirm whose hair it was, police feared it had originated from Micah Pollock. Investigators returned to the area around the strip mines where they found the trash can. This time, they brought a cadaver dog. The dog signaled to a nearby beaver pond. There, in a shallow area of the pond, searchers found the decomposed body of a young man. The victim had been shot in the back. His ankles were bound with rope, and his clothes severely tattered. Through dental records, the medical examiner confirmed that the week-long search for Micah Pollock had finally come to a tragic end. Micah had been killed by a 12-gauge shotgun fired at close range. And based on the bruises and abrasions to the body, the examiner concluded that the teenager had been killed elsewhere, then dragged to the place where his body was found. Now, investigators turned their focus to finding the boy's killer. 16-year-old Andrew Callahan, the last person seen with Micah Pollock, was their prime suspect. With his father present, the teenager refused to answer any questions without an attorney.
Andrew, I have no choice but to arrest you.
Though the case against him was largely circumstantial, investigators placed Callahan under arrest for suspicion of murder.
Anything you say can and will be used against you in court of law.
Detectives secured warrants to search the Callahan family's home and vehicles. Almost immediately, they found the clue.
As we were going up the driveway, you could see something hanging from the back of the vehicle near the bumper. As we got closer, it was obvious that it was a piece of rope hanging from the vehicle.
It appeared to be the same type of rope found tied around Micah's ankles. As the team made their way to the residence, they discovered more rope on the porch. From inside the house, they retrieved 4 shotguns and a bag of hunting clothes that belonged to Andrew. All of the items were sent to the crime lab for testing. Ballistics testing on shotgun pellets is nearly impossible.
Sergeant Badge, may I help you?
And in this case, examiners were unable to demonstrate that the shotguns retrieved from the Callahan's home had been used to murder Micah Pollock. But if technicians could identify even a tiny droplet of Micah's blood on Andrew's hunting clothes, police would be one step closer to tying the suspect to the crime. But none of the clothing samples tested positive for blood. Though convinced of Andrew Callahan's guilt, police couldn't seem to find a shred of physical evidence linking him to the crime. With the suspect unwilling to cooperate, investigators were running out of ways to prove that Callahan was a killer. Police in Cambria County, Pennsylvania struggled to solve the murder of 15-year-old Micah Pollock, whose bullet-ridden and tattered body was discovered in a remote pond. Though all of the circumstantial evidence pointed to 16-year-old Andrew Callahan as the killer, Pennsylvania State Police had little physical evidence to prove it. Their last hope for making their case fell to forensic scientists at the Pennsylvania State Police Crime Lab. Examiner Bruce Tackett looked for consistencies between the rope found tied around the victim's ankles and the samples collected from the suspect's residence.
When I did the rope comparison in this case, I determined that the ropes were a clothesline type rope. They had a woven or a braided cover over top of a core of fairly coarse man-made fibers. I examined all three of those pieces of rope that I had, determined that the construction on all of those was exactly the same.
For proof that all of the samples had originated from the same source, Tackett needed to examine the construction of the rope's core. Under a high-powered microscope, he found that the fibers that made up the core were all indistinguishable from one another.
I was able to determine that those ropes were identical in construction and that the fibers used in the construction of those ropes were the same. So essentially, those three pieces of rope were identical.
The rope used to bind Micah Pollock's feet had come from the same source as the rope tied to Andrew Callahan's car.
You have all this evidence against you.
When confronted with the evidence, Andrew Callahan decided to talk. He admitted that he had shot Micah while the two were hunting. He claimed that when the shooting occurred, he was tracking a bird as it flew into some nearby brush. He believed his gun was positioned at a downward angle. He didn't notice that Micah, who had been standing some distance away, was in his line of fire. Afraid that police wouldn't believe his story, he said he panicked and tried to get rid of the body. Looking to corroborate the suspect's story, police turned to the evidence for answers. From powder burns observed on Micah's body, the medical examiner concluded that the gun was no more than 3 feet away when it discharged. And the shotgun pellets that entered the victim's back came to rest near his jaw. The weapon had been held at an upward angle, contradicting Callahan's claim that he had been aiming at the ground when Micah was shot. Police believe that Callahan went hunting that day with only one target in mind: the teenager who was now dating his ex-girlfriend. Pennsylvania State Police Detective Greg Batcher believed that after the shooting, Andrew systematically went about covering up his actions.
He purchased the garbage can at the store and then returned to the scene. At some point in time, he also gathered a piece of clothesline from his residence. He took these items to the scene, back to where the body was lying.
But when Micah Pollock's body wouldn't fit in the garbage can, he used rope to drag the body some 400 feet behind his car until he reached a remote spot. 16-year-old Andrew Callahan was tried as an adult. He was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. Police believe that irrational jealousy drove Andrew Callahan to murder his rival. But sometimes, investigators can find no motive at all. A suburb of Seattle, the Woodbridge section of Bellevue, Washington, is a quiet neighborhood. One that is unfamiliar with brutal crime. On January 5th, 1997, a morning 911 call brought Bellevue police to a secluded park. A passerby had discovered the lifeless body of a young woman. A rope fastened tightly around the victim's neck made it clear she had been murdered. Police began searching for any form of identification to tell them who this victim was.
No other visible signs.
Lying near the body, they found a checkbook. The account was in the name of Karen White, and it listed a San Diego address. Bellevue police searched through records looking for a Karen White who matched the victim's description. Homicide detective Jeff Gomes found a potential match. A 20-year-old woman with that name and physical description listed a previous address just a few blocks from the park where the body was found. After confirming it was the same Karen White that had been found murdered, Detective Gomes had the grim task of making the notification.
As a detective, one of the most difficult tasks you have is notifying next of kin of a death in their family. I don't enjoy it. It's very difficult to do.
Several hours after the body was recovered, detectives went to the White home. Though several cars were parked in the driveway, the house was dark. No one appeared to be home. Detectives discovered an unlocked door. Fearing that someone could be in danger, one of the officers entered the property. The house was eerily silent. It appeared the residents had been robbed. After finding no one downstairs, the detective proceeded to the upper floors. As he approached a bedroom, he noticed bloodstains on the outside of the door. When he looked inside, he discovered the lifeless body of a teenage girl. She had been viciously beaten and stabbed to death. He yelled for his partner to call in for backup. Next, he followed a trail of blood that led down the hall into another room. There, he found another grisly scene. A middle-aged couple lay dead. Their skulls had been crushed, and they'd been stabbed repeatedly. The victims were later identified as 17-year-old Janet White and her parents, Regina and Walter White. They were the immediate family of the young woman found murdered in the park just hours earlier. Forensic technicians began searching for clues to help them reconstruct what happened. All of the victims had been savagely beaten with a blunt object and then stabbed dozens of times in the face and neck. Police photographed and swabbed dozens of bloodstains. The only real clues to the killer's identity were bloody boot prints found on the carpet. And one on the back of Walter White's shirt. Though the triple murder at the White residence appeared to be the result of a robbery gone bad, that didn't explain the murder of Karen White just a few blocks away.
Just the area around the water tower, the picnic area and stuff, it looked like there's some activity of people being out there, but we don't know if it's related to the crime or not. Not a whole bunch.
In a community that witnessed few homicides, police were convinced that finding an entire family murdered in one day was more than a coincidence.
The main question was, are these scenes connected? Was that the same suspect acting in both scenes? Was it a one-time incident where a person killed this family, or was it a serial killer?
Despite the lingering questions, police were faced with the reality that at least one brutal killer was on the loose in the city of Bellevue. And until they could identify a suspect or an apparent motive, police were powerless to stop him from killing again. While searching for answers in the strangulation murder of 20-year-old Karen White, Bellevue, Washington police made a shocking discovery. A few blocks away from where her body was found, detectives discovered that her parents, Regina and Walter White, and her 17-year-old sister Janet, had been brutally beaten and stabbed to death in their home. Police focused their investigation on Karen's murder, believing that her killer was responsible for the other 3 homicides. Through interviews, investigators learned that before Karen moved to San Diego to become a volunteer in the AmeriCorps program, she associated with a tightly knit group of teenagers who were part of a movement referred to as goth.
Young teenagers dressing all in black, painting their faces white, dyeing their hair. They sometimes pretend to be vampires with fang teeth, and they dress the part. Witches, they pretend to be witches.
Police learned that one of those friends had seen Karen the night before her body was discovered. The friend had stopped by the White residence. Karen had come back to Bellevue for a few days to visit her family. That night, Karen wanted to run out and do some last-minute errands before returning to San Diego the following day. After being dropped off at home a few hours later, Karen said she still had one more errand to run. She wanted to see a teenager named David Anderson, who owed her some money. The friend decided not to go along. Police jumped on the lead. Under questioning, David Anderson, a 17-year-old high school student, confirmed he and Karen White were friends. But he said he hadn't seen her since she had come back into town. On the night of the murder, he stated he was at a friend's house all night. He and his friend never left. When asked if he owned any boots, Anderson said he had one pair and retrieved them for the detective. But it was clear that the sole pattern on his boots did not resemble the bloody prints recovered from the victim's residence. Frustrated, investigators continued interviewing Karen White's friends. One believed she had important information. She said that on the night of the murders, David Anderson had been at her apartment hanging out with her roommate. Around 10 p.m., Anderson and her roommate, 17-year-old Alex Barani, decided to go out. She recalled that Alex had something stuffed inside the sleeve of his overcoat. She thought it was a bat or a club. The woman fell asleep a short while later and was unsure what time the two returned to the apartment. Having caught David Anderson in a lie, police turned to his friend Alex Barani for additional information. Alex was cooperative and even friendly with police. He insisted he and David had been home all night. But when detectives confronted him with his roommate's statements, his demeanor changed. Homicide Detective Bob Thompson.
His chin began to quiver. He immediately started sweating, and he became visibly nervous. I, at that time, decided, I think this guy did the murder.
Under persistent questioning, Alex Barani unraveled. The 17-year-old confessed to all 4 murders. He said after leaving the apartment, he dropped David Anderson off at his girlfriend's house and then went to the park alone to meet Karen White. He planned to tell Karen that David would be unable to pay back the money he owed her. On his way there, he decided he wanted to know what it was like to kill. He strangled the young woman. Fearing that Karen had told her parents her plans, Alex went to her home and bludgeoned and stabbed the family to death. Alex Barani said he had thrown away his boots that had left the prints found at the crime scene. He was placed under arrest and charged with the 4 murders. Though Alex had confessed to the murders, investigators knew from experience that they still needed to scientifically corroborate his statements. And they were unconvinced that he had acted alone. All of the crime scene photographs from the White's residence were sent to renowned blood spatter expert Ross Gardner in Georgia. Gardner looked to reconstruct the triple murder, one droplet of blood at a time.
Most of your forensic evidence tells you who was involved in a crime, but what happened at the crime and how it happened is sometimes very significant. And bloodstain patterns speak to those events that created the bloodstains. They tell us what happened and how it happened.
Using bloodstain patterns observed in the photographs, Gardner first looked to establish what types of weapons had been used in the murders. He recognized 2 distinct cast-off patterns. The first type of pattern was consistent with having been caused by sharp force trauma, most likely by the blade of a knife.
The size of the stains are very small, and here in particular, very similar to what we saw on the scene. And the reason being is we have a very thin edge on which the blood can accumulate as it's being cast off.
A larger blunt instrument made the second type of bloodstain pattern that Gardner identified.
If we were to observe a cast-off that is the result of a club or a bloody hand being swung, something like that, we're going to see a significantly different kind of cast-off. We're going to see larger stains, greater volume, and they're going to develop over a little bit wider area.
Next, Gardner set out to understand the sequence of events inside the master bedroom. His first clue came from the tiny bloodstains found on the back of Walter White's t-shirt. Those stains had originated from his wife, Regina. That suggested that she had been the first victim, attacked in the couple's bed while her husband lay sleeping beside her.
The father had his back to his wife as she was being attacked in the very early stages of the blunt force attack, because it was a very tiny spatter that impacted on the back of his t-shirt.
To understand what happened next, Gardner entered the coordinates of all of the bloodstains found in the room into a computer database. Then, specially designed forensic software was applied to the data. The location and pattern of the father's blood found next to the bed suggested he was attacked with a knife as he tried to get up. A trail of his blood led from that spot to the foot of the bed, where his body finally came to rest. There, more of the father's blood was found spattered on the walls, indicating he came under attack a second time. Those cast-off patterns had been caused by both a knife and a blunt object.
When we took the combination of all the stains that were found in this corner, it really demanded, there was really no other explanation but that this spatter event was occurring and the sharp force was occurring from the other side.
The stains indicated that the attacker stood in front of the victim's head when beating him with a blunt object, which caused his blood to eject into the scene in a radiating pattern. But Gardner found no blood spatter on the surface of one section of wall. The only explanation for the finding was that there was a second attacker standing in front of that wall. Lastly, the blood evidence showed that 17-year-old Janet rushed to her parents' room, but then was attacked and then dragged back to her room, where she became the final victim. Gardner's analysis was consistent with Alex Barani's confession, with one major exception. He had not acted alone. And investigators believed that Alex was protecting his friend, David Anderson. Police obtained a warrant to search the vehicle David Anderson had driven on the night of the murders. They found a length of rope on the front seat. Forensic examiners concluded that it was the same type of rope used to strangle 20-year-old Karen White. David Anderson was also charged with 4 counts of murder. Police believe that David Anderson and Alex Barani murdered Karen White at the park, motivated by sick curiosity. They next set their sights on the victim's entire family. Based on their complete disregard for human life, Alex Barani and David Anderson were tried as adults. Both received 4 consecutive life sentences. In Washington state, analysis of the crime scene helped expose a second killer's identity. But when police are unable to locate a victim's body, proving murder is much more difficult. In the late afternoon hours of November 10, 1995, Rhonda Mitchie entered the Phoenix Police Department to report her child missing. She hadn't heard from her 13-year-old son, Brad Henson, in nearly 12 hours. Though Brad was a responsible and loving son, he seemed to be going through a rebellious phase.
13 years old. He's on a bike.
In fact, Brad had been recently grounded. He was supposed to come straight home after school. After saying goodbye to him earlier that morning, Rhonda, a single mom, went to work. She later learned that there were no classes that day. She called Brad's pager and contacted several of his friends. But the 13-year-old never called back, and his friends hadn't seen him that day. Detective Sally Dillion agreed to look into the case. She was optimistic that there would be a quick resolution.
We thought he ran away from home, that he was staying with a friend, and, that in a day or 2, 3, that he would return home.
But after several days went by without a word, authorities several hundred miles away in California were dispatched to the home of Brad Hansen's father. Investigators hoped they would find the boy there. But Mr. Hansen had not heard from Brad in some time, and he was troubled that his son had not checked in. Phoenix police distributed photographs and a description of the missing boy throughout the area. But no clues to his whereabouts surfaced. A search of the desert and mountain areas outside of Phoenix also turned up nothing. Brad Hansen seemed to have vanished without a trace. Police in Phoenix, Arizona continued searching for 13-year-old Brad Hansen, who had been reported missing by his mother. Having uncovered no clues to the boy's whereabouts, detectives began questioning his classmates. Brad's girlfriend, Jennifer, said that on the day he disappeared, she went over to a friend's house to hang out. Brad was also supposed to be there. But when Jennifer arrived at her friend Jeremy Bach's house, she learned Brad was no longer there. He had left his favorite ski cap behind. Then, in the kitchen, she noticed a hole in the wall. There was also a reddish-brown stain on the floor. 13-year-old Jeremy told her that he and Brad had been playing cops and robbers with his stepfather's guns. Not knowing that the guns were loaded, Jeremy said that Brad pulled the trigger, firing a round into the wall. The stain on the floor, he said, was ketchup. Jeremy told Jennifer that after the gun went off, Brad rushed out of the house, afraid that he would get into trouble. He didn't know where Brad went, and he hadn't heard from him since. Jennifer hadn't heard from him either. Investigators arranged to interview Jeremy Bach and his stepfather. Jeremy told the same story he had relayed to his friend, Jennifer. But when pressed on specific details, Detective Sally Dillion sensed that he wasn't telling the entire truth.
There were parts of it that we had a notion were probably going to be true, and other parts that you could tell weren't. Times when he would make the eye contact and other times when he wouldn't.
As investigators struggled to figure out what Jeremy was hiding, word came in that another classmate wanted to speak with police. In the principal's office at the nearby junior high school, police questioned one of the missing boy's friends. He believed that Jeremy Bach had done something to Brad Hansen. It was well known around school that Brad and Jennifer were boyfriend and girlfriend. And it was also known that Jeremy was extremely jealous. He also liked Jennifer. And though he and Brad were friends, Jeremy tried to break up the young couple's relationship. According to the classmate, Jeremy had been bragging that he was going to hurt Brad. Investigators feared Jeremy Bach had made good on his threat. But to prove that a crime had been committed, they needed to locate the victim's body. To do that, they struggled to put themselves inside the mind of a 13-year-old killer. One who didn't have access to a car.
We really had nothing, so we tried to figure out what we could do, and the only thing that we came up with is we could put him in the trash.
Detectives formulated a plan. Once a dumpster is put out on the curb, it is considered public property in the eyes of the law. 2 weeks after Brad Hansen was reported missing, police returned to the Bach residence. After the trash was put on the curb, investigators confiscated the can and then replaced it with another one. Once the trash can was secured in an evidence property room, Detective Dillian contacted forensic examiners at the Phoenix Police Department's crime lab. As soon as the lid was opened, investigators knew their instincts had been dead on. Large stains and dried liquid pooled in the bottom tested positive for human blood. And forensic scientist Kevin Knapp didn't believe anyone could have survived such blood loss without immediate medical attention.
The dumpster is probably about 2 feet in diameter, and there was probably about an inch deep pool of blood, dried blood, in the bottom of the dumpster. So even without being a medical examiner, in my opinion, it was an awful lot of blood, more than I typically see in a case.
Now, examiners needed to verify that the blood found inside the trash can had originated from 13-year-old Brad Hansen. But there were no DNA samples from Brad to use for comparisons. Knapp had another option to get the evidence he needed.
We all get our DNA from our parents. We get half from our mother and half from our father. So you can look at a DNA profile from an offspring and determine whether or not the DNA pattern from the parents could have formed that child.
When the DNA samples collected from the trash can were compared to the genetic profiles of Brad's parents, examiners found a match. Detectives confronted the 13-year-old suspect with their findings. Now, Jeremy Bach claimed that while playing cops and robbers, his hand accidentally hit the countertop and the gun he was holding discharged. Sending Brad Hansen flying backwards into the wall. He didn't realize that his finger was on the trigger. Panicked, he cleaned up the blood and disposed of the body. For investigators, Jeremy's story stretched credibility.
He had said that when Brad was hit by the bullet that he flew back and he hit the wall. Well, very seldom does someone fly back. That's movies. Okay, that's theatrics. Normally when somebody gets shot by a bullet, they drop. So there were things that he was recounting to us that we did not feel were totally accurate.
Detectives returned to the Bach residence with a search warrant. They collected the 2 handguns that Jeremy's stepfather kept in the house, including the .357 Magnum revolver used in the shooting. And though investigators found traces of Brad Hansen's blood in the kitchen, the findings did little to refute Jeremy's claim that the shooting was accidental. As long as investigators were unable to locate the victim's body, proving murder would be difficult. Blood evidence convinced Phoenix police that missing 13-year-old Brad Hansen was dead. Though they had been unable to locate his body, his classmate Jeremy Bach claimed that he accidentally shot the boy while they played cops and robbers. In a panic, he said he disposed of Brad's body in the trash. But investigators suspected that Brad Hansen had been murdered out of jealousy. Now they needed to prove it. Police turned to forensic examiners for help. At the Phoenix Police Department Crime Lab, firearms expert Mahesh Patel looked for evidence that could prove whether or not the shooting was an accident.
The scenario that was given to me was that Jeremy might have struck the side of the edge of the table and might have accidentally discharged a firearm.
The 357 was constructed with a hammer block, which is designed to prevent it from discharging if accidentally dropped or bumped. Though incriminating, that didn't prove that Jeremy had intentionally fired the weapon. Patel needed to determine how much force had to be applied to the trigger in order to fire the weapon.
What we do is take a set of weights and hang them from the trigger and keep adding on weight to the end of the trigger till it actually goes off, and that will tell us how much force was required for that particular firearm.
Patel determined that 10 1/4 pounds of pressure was required to fire the .357 Magnum revolver. He concluded that an accidental flinch would not have been enough to cause the gun to fire. The analysis indicated that Jeremy Bach intentionally pulled the trigger. 13-year-old Jeremy Bach was placed under arrest and charged with murder. Authorities believe that Jeremy invited his friend Brad Hansen to his house and then confronted him about Brad and Jennifer's blossoming relationship. Driven by a jealous rage, Jeremy grabbed his stepfather's gun and shot Brad. Jeremy Bach, the youngest person to be tried as an adult in the state of Arizona, was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 22 years in prison. Brad Hansen's body has never been found. Sometimes, juveniles believe that homicide is the answer to their problems. When that happens, investigators and forensic scientists must focus on the facts, which can turn dreams of a promising future into the reality of a wasted youth. A quiet Washington state community becomes the backdrop for a string of brutal murders. And all of the evidence suggests that a serial killer is responsible. As investigators struggle to identify a suspect, more bodies continue to surface. In Michigan, the pregnant wife of a promising young attorney is found dead at the couple's home. Though it appears to be the result of a tragic accident, police are not convinced. It falls to forensic examiners to expose the truth. Solving a murder requires a team of experts whose efforts often go unrecognized. When crime fighters meet crime writers, their story is finally told. And many times, it's a tale stranger than fiction. Bellevue, Washington lies just east of the city of Seattle. It's a thriving community of about 100,000 people who live, work, and play here. But in the summer of 1990, young women began turning up dead throughout the city. On Saturday, June 23rd, Bellevue police received a 911 call. restaurant employee had stumbled upon the lifeless body of a young woman. Investigators responded to the scene. They found the victim lying among trash next to a dumpster behind the restaurant. She was nude, except for a necklace. Her arms and legs were positioned as if she were lying in a coffin. A pine cone rested in her hands. It was clear that the victim's body had been posed by the killer. Technicians managed to locate a single black hair near the woman, but they found no clues to her identity or that of her killer. Bellevue detective Marvin Skeen was assigned the case. He knew this wasn't going to be an easy murder to solve.
Most crime scenes, you know who your victim is. In this particular crime scene, we had no idea at all who our victim was, her identification. We also lacked clothing, so we couldn't provide a clothing description when we asked the public for their assistance in determining who the victim was.
The medical examiner concluded that the woman, likely between the ages of 25 and 35, had died as a result of strangulation. She had also been brutally beaten and sexually assaulted. In addition to collecting biological evidence, dozens of fibers clinging to the victim's body were also recovered. Though it wasn't much to work with, detectives forwarded what little evidence they had to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab in nearby Tacoma. After examining the fibers under a microscope, all that scientists could conclude was that they had originated from the carpet or trunk mat of a car. Next, the black hair collected from the crime scene was analyzed, in the hopes it would provide some clue to the killer's identity. Forensic scientist Terry McAdam.
You can look at it for predominantly pigmentation, helps us to decide which possible broad racial groups it may belong to.
From the color, texture, and shape, McAdam determined that the hair had come from an African-American male. But having been found among trash and debris, its connection with the crime was uncertain. Investigators knew the best way to find this killer would be to first identify the victim. But no missing persons reports filed in the city of Bellevue matched their victim.
We went to the news media, who, of course, were interested in the case, asked for their assistance. We also went to teletypes and bulletins to surrounding law enforcement agencies, asking them to check for missing individuals in their cases.
Soon after, investigators got their first break. In a neighboring jurisdiction, a woman reported her roommate missing. From photos taken at the autopsy, she identified the victim as her 27-year-old friend, Marianne Polreich. She said that she had last seen Marianne 3 nights earlier as she prepared to go out for the evening. Marianne had borrowed her roommate's necklace. It was the same one found around the victim's neck. Marianne usually spent her Fridays at a bar just a few blocks from where her body was found.
The roommate indicated to us that Marianne's personality was one that was a free spirit, and that Marianne definitely enjoyed dancing, and that she would go to the various local clubs to dance. That was her main purpose as far as recreation. We learned that Marianne was a very hard worker. We learned that also from co-workers and from employers. But the roommate indicated to us that Marianne would not go with a stranger, someone unknowing to her.
Following up on the roommate's information, police went to the bar where Marianne spent her Friday nights. The restaurant manager knew her well, and she had been there the night before her body was discovered. Though he hadn't noticed who she was with, he believed she had left in a hurry. Marianne had forgotten her sweater and purse. Investigators collected the items, hopeful they contained some clue to her killer's identity. But the evidence failed to yield any useful information. The investigation into Marianne Polreich's murder was going nowhere. And the caseload for Bellevue detectives was about to increase. On August 9th, 1990, police were dispatched to the home of Carol Beathy. Her ex-husband, Paul, had received a call from his two young children earlier that day. They said that their mom was locked inside her bedroom and wouldn't come out. When Paul came to the house, he discovered his 36-year-old ex-wife Carol dead inside her bedroom. It looked as though she had shot herself. When police entered the room, however, it became clear this was no suicide. Though a shotgun lay near the victim, it had not been fired. Instead, the killer had posed the victim's nude body and used the shotgun graphically as a prop. Carol Beathy had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death. But no biological evidence of rape was found. Technicians collected a few black hairs from the sheets. Though robbery did not appear to be a motive, family members later determined that Carol's heirloom ring was missing. For Bellevue homicide detective Dale Foote, the similarities between the Marianne Polreich and Carol Beathy murders had to be more than coincidental.
Bellevue is a pretty quiet suburban town, and we don't have a whole lot of homicides here, so we have two cases with women that are openly displayed and posed nude. We're having some questions. Why are these two cases so similar in nature? Is there any connection between them? Do they know each other? Do their friends know each other? Do they work together? Do they, attend some of these nightclubs together? We just didn't know. So some of those questions we had to answer, and answer real fast.
To find out if the cases were in fact connected, police forwarded the hairs recovered from the Carol Beathy crime scene to the lab. When examiners compared those to the one recovered from the Marianne Polreich crime scene, they concluded that the hairs had originated from the same person. Bellevue police were now faced with the possibility that a serial killer was loose in their city. Looking to find a common thread between the two victims, investigators began interviewing Carol Beathy's co-workers at a popular restaurant where she had worked as a waitress. Carol's friends could not imagine why anyone would have wanted to hurt her. Though she and her ex-husband Paul were divorced, they maintained a great relationship. And Carol's two daughters constantly showered her with love and affection. Though Carol Beathy would sometimes go to nightclubs, police were unable to establish any connection between her and Marianne Polreich. The two unsolved murder investigations quickly became front-page news. Soon, the mystery caught the attention of veteran crime writer Jack Olson. With 10 true crime novels to his credit, Olson recognized that as a writer, this story was too unusual to be ignored.
I think the thing that made this case unusual was the posing of the bodies. That is not seen. It is seen, but it's not seen very often. It represents some kind of a deep-seated hatred of women.
And Bellevue police feared that such a deep-seated hatred would not simply go away on its own. If they didn't identify a suspect in the killings, and fast, it would only be a matter of time until more victims turned up dead. Police in Bellevue, Washington struggled to solve the sexual assaults and murders that had claimed the lives of 2 young women. The bodies of 27-year-old Marianne Polright and 36-year-old Carol Beatty were discovered less than 2 months apart. Having found both victims savagely beaten, sexually assaulted, and their bodies posed after death, investigators had reason to believe that the murders were the work of one predator. But so far, they had no idea who that was or when he would strike next. On September 3rd, 1990, police in neighboring King County received a 911 call. The body of 24-year-old Randy Levine had been discovered by her landlady. She had been savagely beaten, and her nude body was posed suggestively in her bed. Technicians located a single dark hair near the victim's body. The only item determined to be missing from the room was an antique ring. At autopsy, the medical examiner confirmed that Randy Levine had died as a result of blunt force trauma to the head. Though she had also been sexually assaulted, no biological evidence was found. But the medical examiner did find evidence that the young woman had been tortured. 283 tiny puncture wounds dotted her body. The pattern of some of the injuries suggested that the killer had played a game of tic-tac-toe. Because the Levine homicide happened outside the city limits of Bellevue, its parallels to the unsolved Polright and Beatty murders might have gone unnoticed. But then, Bellevue Police Detective Ed Mott received a call from a paramedic who happened to be called to all 3 crime scenes. And he couldn't help but notice the similarities.
He says, I'm not a cop, I'm not a policeman. He says, but the last 3 murder cases I've been to, he says, it's really odd that the 3 bodies have been posed.
Bellevue police also learned that Randy Levine had been to a Bellevue nightclub the night before she was found murdered. There could now be little doubt that a serial killer had claimed the lives of all 3 women. Officers from throughout the area began pooling their resources, desperate to identify this killer before he struck again. The senselessness of the homicides left veteran crime writer Jack Olson struggling for answers. He wondered why these women in particular had been targeted for murder. He could find no rational explanation.
They were perfectly fine women doing exactly what we would expect decent young women of their age, 20, 30, 35, to be doing. They held jobs. They were responsible. Yes, they did go to nightclubs now and then. They're admirable people.
As the hunt for the serial killer intensified, an intelligence officer with the Seattle Police Department believed he had uncovered a possible lead. A few days after the Randy Levine homicide in King County, a man named George Waterfield Russell was arrested near her residence for impersonating a police officer.
You two have been working on
According to the reports, when 32-year-old Russell was pulled over for traffic violations, the officers saw him try to hide something under the vehicle. At first, Russell identified himself as an undercover police officer, but later recanted. Suspicious, the patrol officer searched his car. He located a police scanner, a buck knife, and 2 IDs. Hidden underneath the vehicle, he found a loaded handgun. A check of the serial numbers revealed that the gun had recently been stolen. Russell was placed under arrest for impersonating an officer and being in the possession of a stolen weapon. A records check showed that Russell had an extensive criminal record, which included sexual assaults and cat burglaries. Mostly, George Russell stole jewelry. A further background check revealed that Russell was known to frequent Bellevue area nightclubs, and he had a reputation.
Well, George was a charmer, and basically he was liked in the nightclubs. He was a popular man in the nightclubs. He had a good line of chatter. He would sidle over next to the DJ and they'd have a nice conversation, and then he'd sidle over to the bar and have a nice conversation with the bartender, and then various people, usually young women who came under his aura would sit with him, would buy him drinks, would tell him what a great guy he was.
Though that wasn't a crime, to investigators it went a long way in explaining how the 3 victims could have been manipulated into being alone with the killer.
Hey, how you doing?
Detectives wanted to speak with George Russell about the murders. He claimed he didn't know anyone named Carol Beathy or Randy Levine. However, he admitted knowing Marianne Polreich. In fact, he had seen her at a bar the night before she was found murdered. But he said they weren't there together and didn't speak. Recalling that fibers from a vehicle had been recovered from Polreich's body, police asked for permission to search his car. Russell claimed he had borrowed a friend's truck that night. Eager to cooperate, he gave police the address of his friend who had lent him the vehicle. The man confirmed he had lent Russell his truck several months earlier. He added that when Russell returned the vehicle the following day, there were large stains on the seats, and the interior of the car reeked from a horrible smell. It was so bad, he scrubbed the truck clean later that day. For investigators looking for proof that George Russell was a serial killer, that was the worst news they could hear. Investigators in Bellevue, Washington, believed that 32-year-old George Russell was responsible for a string of brutal sexual assaults and murders that had claimed the lives of 3 young women. Now they needed to prove it. Police located the vehicle Russell had borrowed the night that the first victim, Marianne Polreich, was killed, hopeful it contained evidence of murder. But in the days following the homicide, the truck had been thoroughly cleaned by its owner. But beneath the upholstery, technicians located a suspicious stain. It appeared to be blood. However, it was too degrading for a more comprehensive analysis. Fiber samples from the vehicle's carpet were also collected. At the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab, examiners compared the fibers recovered from the truck to those collected from the body of Marianne Polreich. Though they were consistent with one another, supervising forensic scientist Terry McAdam knows that no analysis is perfect.
We can't say that that fiber came from that car because unless we can take the exact fiber and match up its ends, we can't say that. What we can say is the fiber we find in a suspect's car matches that found on the clothing of the victim as regards to having similar microscopic characteristics. We can't say it's a match.
Still, the finding was enough to allow investigators to obtain a search warrant for the suspect's apartment. There, they found a gym bag filled with slips of paper with women's names and phone numbers written on them. Police contacted several of the women whose names were found in Russell's home. Most knew George Russell well. Though many had no idea how he got their phone numbers, they didn't feel threatened. Russell had told them he was an undercover cop. Homicide Detective Dale Foote.
We kept hearing these same stories about George working for the police and being an undercover agent and that kind of thing. George was very articulate, a very charismatic young man, and a lot of people bought into his story. And actually, the fact that they bought into his story kind of was a hindrance to us because they rather trust George than they would rather trust the police.
But one of the women contacted felt differently, and she had an interesting story for police. She said that recently, George Russell had given her an antique ring. It was his way of apologizing for standing her up on a date the week before. Though she had suspicions that the ring had been stolen, she reluctantly accepted the gift. Shortly after that, she learned Russell was a suspect in the murders.
When she began to hear that George was involved or possibly involved with these homicides, she became frightened. And she gave this ring to another friend of hers who just happened to be leaving town. He was on his way to Florida. And so he took that ring with him. And having arrived down there, a little short of cash, he went down to a pawn shop and pawned this ring. Fortunately, that ring was still there when we called.
Investigators confirmed that it was the same ring that had been stolen from Randy Levine's room at the time of her murder. Convinced they had the serial killer, investigators next looked to tie the suspect to the murder of Marianne Polwright. Detective Marvin Skeen decided to take advantage of a new forensic technology called DNA testing.
At the time in 1991, introducing DNA evidence into court was the first time that it had occurred in King County in the state of Washington. So it was new, very new, and it was something that had to be looked at and a lot of time spent on to make sure that we did it properly and to get it accepted by the court.
It was time well spent. On January 10, 1991, examiners determined that George Russell's DNA matched the biological samples found on Marianne Polwright. He was subsequently charged with her murder. Based on the hair analysis, he was also charged with the murders of Carol Beatty and Randy Levine. Police believe that George Russell used his abundant charm to lure women into his web. And once he had them where he wanted, he pounced on the unsuspecting victims. George Waterfield Russell was convicted of the 3 murders. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms, plus 28 years.
George is a professional listener, not because he really cares, but because that's the way he takes your defenses down and can do whatever he wants. Now, I spent 3 hours with George at Walla Walla Penitentiary, and I mean, this is one of the most horrendous killers that ever lived. but it was a delightful 3 hours. He's interesting on every subject. He's friendly. He smiles and he cracks little jokes. That's on the exterior. What the heck did he
Eddie. All right.
Shock value was part of George Russell's murderous plan, and he went to great lengths manipulating his crime scenes to achieve it.
I heard.
Oftentimes, the significant facts of the case lie just below the troubled surface.